Hello and welcome to World War II Part 26. This is the Eastern Front 1942 Part 2. Okay, so we carry on in mid-July where Army Groups B and A make rapid progress. Okay, the earlier Russian attack towards Kharkov that was cut off and destroyed by General Erich von Manstein really opened holes in the Russian lines and allowed the Germans to make rapid progress. One is headed towards Stalingrad, the other towards Rostov. Now, the 4th Armoured Army is transferred from Army Group B to Army Group A to join operations south of Rostov. And the attack continues. It is picked up real momentum. The Russians put up desperate resistance on the Don in the Stalingrad area to try and give themselves time to start preparing the defences of the city. Now, the Russians are not very keen to lose a city bearing the name of their leader, Joseph Stalin. And in the lead up to the Battle of Stalingrad, the Russians are already with the armies in the area starting to prepare defences. So continuing their advance southwards on a broad front, okay, the Germans take Voroshilovgrad, okay, a mining and industrial area in the middle of the Donets basin. To the southeast, they reach the River Don at the Simansky Heights. The Russians concentrate their forces on the Don, okay, to defend Stalingrad. The Germans, meanwhile, continue their offensive in the direction of Rostov. And really, this is a preparatory phase. The Germans at this point feel that, while not having the rapid success of Barbarossa, that it has been a great start to the summer campaign in 1942, case blue. The Germans now, towards the end of July, approach the gates of Rostov. The Russians are still fighting back desperately in the area of terrain west of Stalingrad. Now, Army Group A takes Rostov. Okay, large Russian forces are wiped out after being completely surrounded. Further German gains. The Germans consolidate their positions at Rostov. Further south, okay, there's growing threat to Stalingrad, but the Russians still hold and maintain control over several bridgeheads west of the Don area. The Germans capture Bataisk, okay, and continue mopping up remains of Soviet forces in the bend of the Don. Now, von Paulus's 6th Army, okay, launched a powerful offensive to eliminate the Soviet bridgehead at Kalach, which is just west of Stalingrad. So the Russians' news bulletins, meanwhile, announced the fall of Rostov. Now, to Russian citizens, pretty much, the Germans are poised to invade the Kuban and the Caucasus. Now, the enemy has attacked Rostov, not from the west as in 1941, but from the north and northeast, the least strongly defended area. The Russians have built defences to the west of Rostov, but the Germans kind of go around the defences by hitting Rostov from the north. Now, the Russians are panicked, okay? Whole units have been disbanded. Men and officers of all ranks are being shot for desertion. The announcement of fall of Rostov spreads terror to the Soviet people. It is a major city in their southern area. 3 days later, Joseph Stalin himself issues a battle cry. Joseph Stalin, he states, "Not one more backward step. In fact, there will be no further withdrawals." Okay, but he also admits that there's little the Russian army can do at the moment to help the Russian people in the area of Rostov. But Stalin is issuing the battle cry there: no more retreats. We must fight for every inch of ground. Now, after fall of Rostov, okay, an iron discipline is introduced in Red Army. Okay, deserters are executed on spot. More authority is given back to the officers, and political commissars are subordinated to them. Now, officers are given more of a professional status. Among other things, the gold stripes are restored to the uniforms, and new decorations are created for officers only, inspired by patriotism, not politics. So the Russian army are trying to put moves in place to give the army and the officers who fight in the army and command the units a bit more credibility and pride, in the hopes that will stiffen their resolve. Now, the Germans basically establish a bridgehead over the river Manich in the Caucasus. By end of July, the German advance is going very well. Rostov has fallen. The Germans are starting to advance into Caucasus. They are approaching Stalingrad. At the end of July, Southern Sector Army Group A consolidates its bridgehead over River Manich, while Army Group B concentrates on reducing the Russian bridgehead at Kalach, in the Don estuary west of Stalingrad. In the central sector, the Russians attack in the Rezev area. So the Russians, even though with the calamitous scenario developing in the south, with the huge holes torn in Russian lines and the rapid German advance, the fall of Rostov, the advance to the area west of Stalingrad, the Russians are still trying to attack in the central sector before Moscow. Now, in southern sector, Army Group A, once more including 1st Armoured Army, fans out south of Rostov, the cut railway lines, and take the towns of Salsk and cut railway lines in between Rostov and Stalingrad. Now, advance guards reach the Kuban River in the Army Group B sector. Bitter fighting continues in Bend of the Don, west of Stalingrad, where Germans are trying to cut off the defenders in pockets. In central sector, the Russians, meanwhile, launched even more fresh attacks in the reserve area. Now, into early August, the German Army Group A advances swiftly in the Kuban area. They capture towns near Stavropol, and the Germans cross the Don, and establish bridgeheads, then push on to nearby towns to seize them. Now, advancing more slowly from there towards Stalingrad over the coming weeks. However, the Russians succeed in holding regions north of the Great Bend of the Don with a certain number of bridgeheads across the river, for instance at Kletskaya, barring the way to German Army Group B. In central sector, the Russians meanwhile are continuing their attack in the reserve area, but soon, over the coming 2 months, Russian emphasis and focus will switch to the southern front. So, still in early August, German Army Group A establishes a bridgehead over River Kuban in the area of Amavir. Now, a short way from the northern foothills at Caucasus and the Maykop oil field. So it just shows how rapid the German advance has been into the Caucasus. Those holes ripped in Russian lines have allowed the Germans to put up a huge attack. And now, pretty much, with the rapid advance, they are not really too far from the Maykop oil fields in the Caucasus. Now, the Red Army continues to be very courageous and spirited in its defence in the Bend of the Don before Stalingrad, but they are also being pushed back there. Now, the Germans take Tizoretsk, in the Kuban area, south of Rostov, and seize Amavir on the River Kuban with Army Group A, while Soviet resistance to Army Group B in the Bend of the Don, west of Stalingrad, is now starting to show signs of weakening. So, pretty much by the end of the first week of August, the Germans are making rapid progress, and they are definitely achieving many of their initial goals, and confidence in German army is definitely high at this point as they advance. German Army Group A captures the oil fields at Maykop and Krasnodar in the Caucasus, Soviet resistance favoured by terrain takes on a new strength in the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains. So the Russian units in the area of the Maykop oil fields are still resisting, but now they've moved into foothills, they're moving into more mountainous terrain, hilly terrain, to continue the fight in a more guerrilla way. So basically approaching mid-August, the German threat to Stalingrad increases as Army Group B eliminates the Soviet bridgehead at Kalach in the Bend of the Don. Now, Hitler and Halder, meanwhile have disagreements. Halder still insists that priority should be given to capture of Moscow, while Hitler is still maintaining the first objective has to be the Caucasus oil fields. Now, Hitler feels that by capturing Caucasus oil fields, he'll be able to supply Germany with a limitless supply of oil, as well as cutting off those oil sources to the Red Army. But those oil sources are not the only oil sources available. And like I demonstrated in last part, the front that the German army would have to hold is a front of 2,500 miles. And like I said, even taking off the 1,100 miles of coastline for the Caspian Sea, etc., you are talking about a front line of 1,400 miles, which is like 300 to 400 miles longer than the entire front if you go from Leningrad to Rostov in the south. And basically the German army, and especially in Army Group South with heavy emphasis on more Romanian units, Hungarian units, the Italian 8th Army, mixing in with the Germans that just didn't have the strength to hold a front like that. And also, Hitler has overestimated the effectiveness of this on Germany's war effort, because Germany has enough oil, even without the Caucasus oil fields, to wage war for nearly 3 years. So Hitler, to me, if I was Hitler and I was planning for 1942, I would have focused on a consolidation, okay? I would have focused on holding the front, absorbing and counterattacking against any Soviet attacks, and I would have waited while 1943 to launch a fresh summer campaign when many more of the new weapons, the heavier PZKW-4s that had been upgraded with a bigger gun, the new Tigers and Panthers were coming into the fray. That's what I would have done. But also doing that, the danger would have been that the Red Army would have been free to attack at will, would have been able to move units, would have been under no pressure, which could cause further problems. Now, Russians attacking the reserve area reached their maximum intensity, but still gaining no result. This is why I argued against an attack in 1942 when I was asked about it, because like in the central sector, the Russians are attacking, but they're not able to really make any headway against the Germans. So in the southern sector, okay, advanced guards of the German Army Group A basically reach Slavyansk, okay, in the Cuban area, only a little way from the east coast of the Sea of Azov. So the German advance has now, from an initial advance, has turned into a huge territory grab. The Germans are actually seizing so much territory and advancing so far, but little do they realise the devastating battle to come. So the Germans take Elista in the Kalmyk district, okay, south of Stalingrad and southeast, of the Caspian Sea. So they are closing in on Stalingrad, but stiff Russian resistance is definitely holding them up. So by mid-August, a large part of von Paulus's 6th Army, supported by General Hoth's Armoured Army, completes the capture of the whole region within the bend of the Don, apart from a few minor Soviet bridgeheads in north, and advances on Stalingrad from the southwest and northwest. So now there's a two-pronged push from the German army advancing towards Stalingrad. Meanwhile, Germans take more towns in the foothills of the Caucasus, hundreds of miles far away from Stalingrad. And really, with the German army being able to fight for another estimated 3 years with the oil reserves they already had, it just speaks to me of the mind Hitler had. He made this decision and focused the entire German army on this southern push without accurately having the figures and information there. Just one of Hitler's failings. So Germans establish bridgeheads over the river Kuban in the Caucasus and capture, thermal stations, Essentuki, Kislovodsk, in the Caucasus foothills. Now, units at German 1st and 4th Mountain Divisions get ready to climb Elbrus, okay, the highest peak in the Caucasus at over 18,000 feet. But this is more an athletic than a military undertaking, okay, given nature of terrain. The Russians will always have an advantage over attacking forces, and some people feel those mountain divisions were sent to climb Elbrus as a more stature point, which in the middle of war there's no real time for. So Germans advance on a wide front in Donbass, and a Russian counterattack opens a gap between the Italian army, the Italian 8th Army, and the German 6th Army. Now, meanwhile, okay, separated way in the northern sector from this period, mid-August until end of September, Russians in Leningrad and the Volkhov sector launched a series of attacks to try and cut the corridor between Tosno, south of Leningrad, and Lake Ladoga, okay, in order to relieve Leningrad. But the German 18th Army is successful in repulsing these attacks. Just further evidence, okay, that the Red Army in the reserve area and now in the north in the Leningrad front, the Germans are able to hold the Russian attacks. So the Germans advance southeast of Stalingrad, okay, it's held up on the river Aksai and Mishkova, okay, the two rivers there, temporarily just halt the German advance with stubborn Russian resistance. So elements at German Army Group A take Krymsk, okay, and on north coast at Black Sea, not far from Novorossiysk, okay. So the Germans really have reached the Black Sea pretty much. It's a ridiculous advance, really. But little do the Germans realise the horror and trial that is to come. So basically by August 23rd, okay, the German Army Group B breaks through north of Stalingrad in direction of the Volga, capturing a salient 5 miles wide. Now, meanwhile, 600 Luftwaffe bombers attack Stalingrad. They kill nearly 50,000 people and destroy 3/4 of the city of Stalingrad in incessant bombing attacks. They literally start now. The plan is to basically start bombing Stalingrad now into a pulp, so that by the time German armies get there, resistance will be very little. But they do not count on the ferocious Russian dedication to not lose the name of the city bearing their leader. So, after nearly 50,000 dead and three-quarters of the industrial city of Stalingrad bombed mercilessly, but the Russians, meanwhile, are absolutely resolute to defend Stalingrad now to avoid encirclement and to stabilise, their front lines. Russian troops fall back in the direction of Stalingrad to shorten the front, close any salients. Now, in Great Bend of the Don, 600 men of the Italian Savoy Cavalry Unit under command of Colonel Bertone charge against 2,000 Russians armed with mortars and machine guns in a last desperate attempt to close a breach opened by the Russians between the German 6th Army and the Italian 8th Army. Now, the Italians in the last cavalry charge in history put the enemy to flight. 600 Italian cavalry, the last known cavalry charge in history, charges at the Russians. 2,000 men with mortars and machine guns, and the Italians put them to flight. The victory is important locally, but the price is very high. Now, the swastika flag, meanwhile, flies at the summit of Mount Elbrus, planted there by those German mountain troops I mentioned earlier. So the Germans at the moment have no idea. They have no idea of the horror to come. At the moment, they're even wasting units to climb Mount Elbrus, which is more of a stature thing and an accomplishment thing than a military objective. So this kind of shows the confidence in German army. You know what? We can spare 2 divisions. Why not? Send them to climb biggest mountain in Caucasus, 18,000 fleet, and plant a flag there, so we can put it in pictures in German newspapers. The German Army Group A, meanwhile, repulses a Russian counterattack at Modzok and heads for Grozny and Baku, in the Crimea. So basically, the Russian counterattacks are achieving very little. Now, Army Group B, meanwhile, exerts continued pressure on Stalingrad, where bitter fighting is taking place now. Army Group A approaches Grozny and establishes a bridgehead over the river Terek. Now, German Army Group A begins the assault on Novorossiysk, on the Black Sea. The Germans are just, having success pretty much everywhere. Russian attacks are being beaten down and halted. And at the moment, the Germans have no idea of the danger coming. Now, despite increased Russian resistance on River Terek, the forces of Army Group A strengthened their bridgehead over the river in the area of Mozdok. Russians claim to be within 15 miles of Stalingrad, on the southwest front. So the Russians are now fighting back, being pushed back towards the city of Stalingrad itself. So desperate fighting, takes place in Stalingrad area. German 6th Army continues its relentless assault. The Germans have now reached the suburbs of the city by the beginning of September and threaten to cut off the entire Soviet 62nd Army. Now, Army Group A takes the ports of Anapa on the Black Sea. German Army Group A fights its way to Novorossiysk and Grozny. Other German and Romanian troops, cross the Kerch Strait from the Crimea, so Novorossiysk is threatened from the west as well as from the north in an attempted pincer movement. Now, the threat to Stalingrad early September becomes graver as the Germans break through to the Volga south of the city of Stalingrad and penetrate into the western suburbs of the city. The Luftwaffe are still making incessant aerial attacks, bombing the city. But in a way, bombing the city like they do, they turn the city into a mountain of rubble, a fortress of little cubby holes, sniper holes, wrecked buildings that would be fought for, as I will detail further in time. Now, on the 4th September, over 1,000 German aircraft launched continuous assaults on the city of Stalingrad as the Germans attempt to push beyond the suburbs and advance into the city itself. Now, the Germans take, on 6th September, they take the major Black Sea port of Novorossiysk. The Battle of Stalingrad, or as become known, the Red Verdun, reaches critical phase as both sides throw reinforcements into Stalingrad. So the Russians managed to contain pressure both at Stalingrad and east of Novorossiysk. The Russians are now fighting insanely hard and trying to halt the Germans wherever they advance. But the German 6th Army continues its intense pressure on outskirts of Stalingrad from the south and the north. Remember, they were coming at Stalingrad from 2 different directions, and they are pushing hard and advancing slowly with stiffer Russian resistance, but still advancing in both directions. Now, Commander Russian 6th Second Army, the backbone of Stalingrad's defense, is given to General Zhukov, okay, one of the great generals of World War II, and also the 12th of September, okay, an ominous day for the Germans. The first reported winter snows are reported in the Caucasus, showing signs that winter is indeed coming. So on September 13th, the Great Battle for Stalingrad enters its 4th week. The Germans are now in the edge of the city, and have been fighting its suburbs for some time. But now, September 13th, the German 6th Army manages to start pushing into the city. Now, basically, within the next 5 weeks, okay, Germany will take most of the city, but the Russians' dogged and spirited resistance will stop them taking the position entirely. So the Russians are holding no more than 3 bridges now across the Volga, but the mass of the Russian artillery is dug in on the other side of the Volga, okay, and is relatively protected from German air attacks. So while the Germans are pushing into Stalingrad, and while the Germans are holding the west bank of the Volga, much of the Russian artillery is on the other side, just firing on the Germans at will. Now, to avoid sufferings endured by German troops the previous winter, Hitler appoints some generals, okay, Generals Halder and General Weizsäcker, okay, to look after military requirements and supplies. The idea is that this winter doesn't catch the German army out quite as badly as they were caught out in the first winter, when basically they weren't given winter gear and no preparations were made because the war was going to be over within 3 months. So basically, von Paulus's infantry by mid-September, okay, overcoming desperate Russian resistance and penetrate right into the centre of the city of Stalingrad, reaching the banks of the Volga. The Battle of Stalingrad is intensifying and becoming more heart-wrenching. The Germans attack powerfully in the centre of Stalingrad. Hundreds of Stuka dive bombers and low-level bombers attack the city, reducing it further to rubble. But the Russians, okay, holed up in their factories, are holding out and are putting up absolutely epic resistance. Fierce fighting, okay, is now going on in northwest outskirts of Stalingrad as the Russians are fighting for every inch of terrain. And in fact, the fighting was so bitter, the resistance was so fierce that one Russian officer, when communications were cut between one portion of his unit and the other portion of the unit, one Russian officer actually put live wires in his mouth, okay, getting electrocuted to death, but he managed to re-establish communications. That is how fierce the Russians were. They refused to surrender the city of Stalingrad. A Russian officer put live wires in his mouth to reconnect radio communication. I mean, incredible stories of heroism. Now, the bitter house-to-house fighting continues towards end September in Stalingrad, whereas in Leningrad, Russian women fight side by side with men. Army Group A, meanwhile, takes the town of Terek on the south bank of the river of the same name in the centre of the Caucasus. Meanwhile, Russians continue, okay, to hold German forces in northwest suburbs of Stalingrad. And the Luftwaffe just continue to pound the city to dust. Now, September 23rd, okay, the Russians launch a counterattack in northwest suburbs of Stalingrad. German Army Group A sends an assault group to take the port of Tuapse, okay, on the Black Sea northwest of Sochi. The Germans are still wanting to secure vital ports and areas around the Black Sea. The Russians' counterattack at northwest of Stalingrad continues to make progress. The Germans report bitter hand-to-hand fighting. The Russians are absolutely fighting tooth and nail, trying to force the Germans back. Now, in the reserve sector, in the central sector, the Russians cross the Volga and capture 25 villages. Meanwhile, heavy fighting continues around Leningrad as the German 18th Army is still resisting fierce Russian attacks, trying to cut German supply lanes off at Stalingrad. Meanwhile, the Germans flood more reinforcements into the battle for the city. So by the start of October, the impetuous German thrust is becoming exhausted, okay? Bloody fighting continues in Stalingrad, where German 6th Army pays dearly for every yard of ground gained. Now, the Russians try in vain to bring help to ruined city. You know, at one point, they were even bringing flotillas of transport boats across the Volga, under incessant air and artillery attacks. And many of these Russian soldiers would disembark these transport craft from the east bank of the Volga into the city of Stalingrad, and they were fighting on the front line within a space of 100 yards. I mean, in some places, the Russian front line was only 100 yards, some places less, against the Volga, where Russian troops were just holding and would not surrender despite repeated German attacks. So, Army Group A is charged with conquering Caucasus and retrieving all its oil fields, is halted now by bitter Soviet resistance showing up in the Caucasus. Now, the Germans do not succeed, in taking Grozny. Bitter fighting continues between Novorossiysk and Tuapse on the Black Sea. Heavy losses in men and material and shortage of supplies and nature terrain are beginning to tell on the German forces in the area. Now, in the Caucasus, German Army Group A makes some progress towards Grozny. The battle for Stalingrad, meanwhile, continues, but the Russian position is gradually, but at immense cost, improving. So the Russians are just throwing everything they have into the Battle of Stalingrad. There are reports in the Battle of Stalingrad of battles for the tank factories, more notably the Red October tank factory, that had damaged or destroyed tanks, and some tanks that were being repaired. Some of these tanks would actually be wheeled out in the middle of the battle and start firing at oncoming German troops and German pressure. There were even troops around the Red October tank factory fighting out of the building while the building would come under increased attack. And inside the building were Russian mechanics and engineers repairing tanks to drive straight out of the doors, straight into the battle. The fighting for the factories, the tank factories, was especially fierce. Incredible. So single command is now restored in Red Army on the Eastern Front, early October. Now the military commander now has responsibilities given to commanding officers in all other armies. The political commissar, is to be designated vice commandant, in political field and army units, but all responsible decisions of a military nature are now reserved solely to the commanding officer. So I think Stalin is starting to realise that some of his reforms with political commissars are now taken away from the ability of the Russian commanders to wage war as they see fit. So now Stalin is re-putting some of those controls back in the hands of the Russian military officers. So after 51 continuous days fighting, by mid-October, no German infantry or tank assaults take place at Stalingrad. The Germans are literally being bled dry by the continued Russian resistance. Now, meanwhile, by October 14th, an ominous report of a Russian relief force reported to be within sight of Stalingrad itself. Now, meanwhile, while the Germans are fighting into Stalingrad, this bitter house-to-house fighting is going on, where a building may have 4 floors. The Germans own the bottom floor, the second floor is vacant, floor 3 and 4 are owned by the Russians. The Germans would spend a day or two fighting up the floors, clearing the building out, taking floors 3 and 4 from the Russians, but meanwhile, while doing that, more Russian reinforcements have come in and have now taken the ground floor. So now the Germans, who had the ground floor and were fighting up to clear the building from Russians, suddenly are trapped on the higher levels at building by fresh Russian troops who've come in. This is how bitter and horrible the fighting in Stalingrad was. The fighting was for every inch of ground, every floor, every room, every building. They would often fight for a building and would have to stage pitched fights for sometimes 24 hours just to capture a few rooms from dug-in Soviet defenders. The fighting was absolutely ferocious, and basically it tied, von Paulus's 6th Army plus other elements of German Army, it tied so many troops up there for so long, for months. They've already been fighting in Stalingrad and the approaches to Stalingrad for now nearly 2 months, and there is no end in sight. The Russians are still flooding reinforcements in. So basically by mid-October, renewed German assaults take place in Stalingrad. Tanks and infantry advance advancing several areas, but desperate and stiff Russian resistance continues. The Russians are not going to give up the city. So basically, violent fighting continues. Heavy rains are reported in Stalingrad. And now on October 22nd, okay, the first winter snowfalls are reported on the hills outside Stalingrad. The winter snows will soon be there, which will, of course, change things for the German army more so. But the Germans really, even at this time, they've captured the bend of the Don. They've captured pretty much 75-80% of Stalingrad. At one point, they captured about 90% of the city. Stiff Russian counterattacks and resistance have pushed them back in some areas. And they have had massive success in the Black Sea area and the Caucasus, despite now stiff resistance forming there. The Germans actually have achieved massive gains in the summer. But as I've said all along, they are just not capable of holding this front line. And while German armies are tied up in the Don Bend and at Stalingrad, where von Paul's 6th Army of near 250,000 men and many tanks is now engaged in bitter fighting, that army is tied down. Many of the Romanian, Italian, Hungarian units, they are given the job of protecting the flanks of the German armies fighting in and around the Stalingrad area. But therein comes the weakness, okay? Because while the Romanians at times and the Italians with the cavalry charge and the Hungarian units, while they have at times shown bravery, they are not as highly trained or as battle experienced as some of the German troops fighting in Stalingrad. And assigning them to protect the flanks, the one thing that the Hungarians, Romanians and Italians cannot stand against is a massed Soviet tank and infantry artillery assault. Okay, and the Russians are preparing a bit of a surprise, okay, for the Germans. So the battle for Stalingrad rages on. Now in the Caucasus, Army Group A takes Nalchik. Despite renewed Soviet vigour in their defence, the Germans are still making some gains, but not as rapid as they were earlier in the summer campaign. But the Germans still at the moment don't see the danger, okay? They don't see the danger at the moment. Now, fighting at Stalingrad at the start of November, the Russian 62nd and 64th Armies and the German 6th Army and 4th Armoured Army is continually as fiercely, as bitterly as ever. The Russians and Germans are literally fighting for ground that one German officer said, we used to fight for ground in miles, now we're fighting for ground in inches. Literally, there'd be whole areas of the front line at Stalingrad where fighting would go on for days, and the Germans would advance from one pile of rubble to the next pile of rubble 10 yards away, and then they'd be pinned down again by stiff Russian resistance. The fighting really was that fanatical. But the German dream of capturing entire city of Stalingrad is beginning to fade, okay? The Russians are just fighting so fiercely. Now in Caucasus, okay, the Red Army has succeeded in frustrating every effort by German Army Group A to take Grozny. The Germans do succeed in taking Alagir in the centre of the Caucasus, an important road junction southwest of Nalchik. But their successes now in the Caucasus are reducing. And now it's only mainly local successes they have in certain areas. But overall, the Germans are coming to a halt. So basically, desperate fighting continues at Stalingrad. The Russians launch attacks in all of the sectors of the front to discover the weak points in the German winter line, and the German winter line has some major weak points that the Russians will be able to take advantage of. Now in Caucasus, the Red Army firmly now starts repulsing multiple German attacks in multiple areas in the Caucasus. The Russians now have the Germans fairly held by the end of the first week of November. The Russians are now holding the Germans in Caucasus. The advance has reached its height. So basically, okay, the Foreign Army's East Branch, okay, of the German Information Service now starts issuing reports after the first week of November has passed that Russian forces are now concentrating in the Stalingrad area opposite the Romanian Third Army. Now these build-ups are starting to look ominous. The German services are not able at this stage to say whether these concentrations suggest a big general offensive or simply a local counterattack in the area. But as we will see, the counterattack is an enormous counterattack. Like I said, with the German army being tied down for as long as they were in Stalingrad and around the Stalingrad region, it has given the Red Army the option of planning out a massive winter campaign, a massive counter-offensive, which comes in with bitter force. Now, by mid-November, bitter fighting is continuing in Stalingrad. After a few days of fair quiet on the front, there's been a war zone for nearly 3 months now. Now, on the Caucasus fronts, okay, Berlin admits the initiative is now passing into Russian hands. So after all the advances, okay, we've seen Russians start throwing extra troops into the area. We have seen the Russians now start to throw back German offensives and to stabilise the front. And now Berlin has officially admitted that in the Caucasus, the Russians, with increased reinforcements, stabilising the front line, they now have the advantage of position in the Caucasus Mountains. So basically, okay, now on November 18th, the Russians are about to launch a huge offensive against the Germans at Stalingrad. Now, in Stalingrad itself, a part of German 6th Army and part of the 4th Armoured Army. Now, southwest at the city is Army Group B under von Weichs, were part of 4th Armoured Army and the Romanian 4th Army, okay? Now, further north from Stalingrad, in Great Bend of the Don, the Italian 8th Army and the Romanian 3rd Armies that, frankly, are not equipped to deal with this huge Soviet attack that is coming. Literally thousands of guns, thousands of tanks, hundreds thousands of men. The Russians have built a massive pincer to envelop the German armies at Stalingrad, and unfortunately the Romanian and Italian armies will not be able to resist them. So on Russian side, north of the Don, okay, beyond the river is the southwest front commanded by General Vatutin, comprising the 1st Army, the 5th Tank Army and the 21st Army. Now between Kletskaya, okay, and Stalingrad is deployed the Don front under the command of Rokossovsky, made up of the 65th Army, the 24th Army and the 66th Army. And from Stalingrad to south is the Stalingrad front, okay, commanded by Eremenko and comprising part of the 62nd Army under General Zhukov, the 64th Army, the 57th Army and the 51st Army. The Russians have succeeded in reorganising their armies in the southern front into these 3 or 4 huge areas, and basically the Russians are now prepared to go over to the offensive. So the next day, November 19th at 8:50 a.m, okay, Russian soldiers in Stalingrad awoke to a sound they called a distant thunder. The Russian soldiers said they could hear a distant thunder. What was that thunder? That was thousands and thousands of Russian artillery pieces launching a huge artillery bombardment on the German, Romanian, Italian armies on the flanks of Stalingrad. Thousands of Russian artillery pieces. After this murderous artillery preparation, the Russians launched thousands of tanks, hundreds, thousands of men. And this is the beginning of the German disaster on the Stalingrad front. Now, 6th Corps of the Don front, okay, advance beyond the Don, advance 75 miles northwest of Stalingrad. Further north, armies at southwest front are advancing on the Don about 95 miles northwest of Stalingrad, and a pincer movement is beginning. The other line is positioned to south of the Stalingrad front, which will develop during the next few days. Now, the Germans and Romanians hold out fairly well everywhere, except that a powerful Russian penetration is immediately reported in the Kletskaya area. The commander von Weichs of Army Group B, consisting of part of 4th Panzer Army and the Russian 4th Army, orders immediate counterattacks, but all that results in is temporary containment of the enemy. So, while fighting rages in north of Stalingrad, a new large-scale attack by Russians gets underway from Bet Kukova, south of the city. 3 Russian armies are engaged, the 64th, 57th and 51st, who have several armoured and mechanised corps. Hundreds of Russian tanks, T-34s, KV tanks, their heavy firepower. Now, the Russian forces are subdivided into the Don group, attacking from north, and Volga attacking from the southeast. So I will leave it there on World War II, Part 26, the Eastern Front, 1942. After the initial doomed attack by the Russians towards Kharkov that General Erich von Manstein very cleverly fell back, allowed the Russians to penetrate, pulled them to severe length of their supply lanes to where the supplies were hindered. Then he counterattacked, crushing entire Soviet armies, taking lots of tanks, guns, thousands of them, tens of thousands of prisoners, tore holes in Russian line. The Germans have had a major advance but have been slowed down after the fall of Rostov and Stalin's battle cry that no more retreating. The new orders to Russian military officers taken from the political commissars and the reinforcements and savage Russian determination to resist the Germans slowed them before Stalingrad. They've been fighting in Stalingrad now nearly 2 months, and now the massive Russian counterattack has begun, that I will cover in part 20, well, in the next part of the Eastern Front, 1942 part 3. I will cover the Soviet counterattack, we'll look at the forces involved and continue the Battle of Stalingrad into 1943. So that is part 26 of Ultimate World War II. I will be back soon with part 27, focusing back in the Pacific Theatre. I'm out for now.